Adam, it is really nice to reconnect here. Thank you for joining me on In the Trial podcast. As we get going, tell us a little bit more about yourself. Who you are, what are you up to? Our goal is let's talk innovation, let's talk about the industry, what's working, what's not working, and enjoy the conversation.
Well, firstly, it's a delight to be here, Wissam. I'm Adam Walker. My background is in biometrics, data, stats, medical writing in and around clinical trials. So I've been doing this for the last 30 years, believe it or not. I've worked in big pharma, small pharma, biotech, CROs, and even at the MHRA for my troubles. So the last 10 years or so, I've been an independent consultant. And in the last year, like you, I've delved my toe into the water of podcasting. See what I did there? And it's a very interesting place to be because, of course, I love having interesting conversations with people. Like you, I'm passionate about clinical research and clinical trials. And I just similarly want to just have very open and honest conversations, the good and the bad and the ugly, to be quite frank.
Sweet. 30 years. That's a lifetime and a half. Tell me a little bit more. How have you seen? I mean, listen, clinical research is huge. There's so much to do from pharma, biotech, device. As we talk about over the last 30 years, what have you seen changed? And where do you feel like the industry is going to right now?
Well, you're right. 30 years is a long time. I was definitely a boy when I joined this industry, straight from university. In those days, we were dealing with paper CRFs. Everything was on paper and pen. NCR paper, do you remember that?
Mhm.
Non-carbon return paper, where we had layer upon
Layer,
layer, and then we would
copy, and
fax.
then you get
Oh,
one copy here, one copy there. I remember those days. I remember the days when
yeah.
we used to get those, and then we had to transcribe them into, was it Microsoft Access, I think it was, and some studies were like Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So we were doing double data entry back in those days in the earliest form. And the first role I had was with a company that was bought out by Quintiles that now is IQVIA. So showing my age again, technology was pretty limited in those days, but we thought we were at the forefront. I would say, in answer to your question, what's changed is everything's changed, but it hasn't happened overnight. Clearly, it's happened very incrementally, and there have been a few times when things seem to have fast forwarded a little bit. And what I really recognize is just the fact that I've had to adapt and learn new skills along the way around technology and communication skills globally, using Zoom or Teams or whatever we're doing. All of these skills have made the world smaller and, in theory, should have made the clinical trial process faster, but I'm not convinced that they have.
You know, on the podcast that you and I did, you asked me a question that was interesting. It makes me think a lot, which is, what would you tell your younger self? So now, as you're actually talking about how young you were when you started this and coming into this now, if you were to look back then, what would you tell your younger self?
Well, having heard that question asked many times now, some of the best answers I've had have really probably framed my answer to that. And the one that resonates the most with me and is truest to me is actually I would have taken more risks younger. I wish if I had my time again, I had gone independent sooner. I don't wish to have been necessarily pushed into redundancy again. But the reality is that when you're pushed out of your comfort zone and you have to do something different, you do. So over my shoulder there is the comfortable chair. I don't really like that comfortable chair. It looks great, but it's not that comfortable. And my life is not a comfortable chair. So I like discomfort and I like to push the boundaries. And so risk taking has definitely been a more pivotal thing in my last 10, 15 years of my career than it was before because I was starting out in this world. with a family, with a career. I didn't know how long it was going to be. I didn't know anything at that time. And all along the way, I've gained experiences and had opportunities that have really helped me understand and decode the world as it is today. It's complicated, but actually, it's quite simple. I used to overcomplicate things a lot.
So talking about complication, I always tell people this is a complicated industry, but I also think that sometimes we overcomplicate things. So as you have kind of paved your path and kind of gone through it, what do you see has been, I don't know if you were to think of like, here's like, two or three things that have been, this industry has really overcomplicated it. What would that be?
I think the real difficulty that we have is that many of the incremental changes that have been implemented, and I'm thinking again around technology, have happened, but because we are on this kind of railroad of continuity, no one ever stops. So no one ever stops and says, blank canvas, right, let's start this all over again. In other words, if we were going to do this right and build it from the ground up, what would we do today differently? And the analogy I have, which I've heard used several times as well, is trying to build a plane mid-flight, trying to stick the wings on and move around the engines when you're mid-flight and you're halfway across the Atlantic. It's impossible. And it's highly complicated. It comes with enormous risk. And unfortunately, that's where I think we find ourselves, 20, 30 years into a career. And I can see that we're trying to reinvent the wheel. It's very difficult to do that, even though we've got more amazing technology than I could ever have dreamed of in the palm of our hands, never mind on our desktops. The computing capability we have today is a million times more than it was probably 10 years ago. And we've both got kids who've grown up and they're native with phones. They don't know any different. We do. We know how to simplify our lives. We know how to turn down the volume on the chaos. But for the next generation behind us, it's a tricky world to navigate.
If you think about kind of all the projects and clients that you've worked on, what is one project that you feel like you walked in and you're like, man, you're just you're killing me. You're overcomplicating the life out of this.
There have been some very complicated studies I've worked on. The most complicated studies I ever worked on were QT studies in an early phase clinical trial unit where we were taking triplicate ECGs for about 8 or 9 weeks. And so there was more data than I've ever experienced in my life. And I do remember thinking, I will never do this ever again if anyone ever were to ask me. And it came down to a final review of the tables, figures, and listings and the clinical study report. And there were probably 15, 20 people stuck in a room for 72 hours. We barely slept. And we had to go through those triplicate ECGs and manually check whether or not we were satisfied with the outcomes of that. That was highly complicated. And I'm not sure we got the best outcomes from it, but I did learn that it was without exception the hardest I've ever worked, but also the most complicated data I'd ever seen. Now I think we would run it through a large language model, simplify it in a second or two, get some nice curves coming out the other side and go home, or maybe go down the local cafe for a coffee.
And we're done in minutes. Oh man,
Exactly.
I remember the days I tell my kids about like how I used to work like weekends and weeknights because of all the manual activities that we had to do. And they're like, why? But then it makes me kind of think about like innovation, right? Like, I've been in this industry for what, 27 years. We've seen a lot of innovation that came through. A lot of it, some stuck and some of like was gone. Like I remember the days of the paper case report forms where we had this OCR tools, right? We thought it was like best thing on earth. However, You had to put everything in a specific box in order for the OCR to actually recognize this. And sometimes it wasn't perfect. You still had to have a second person to actually review the data after it was entered. But then you look at today's date, there's like EDC, there's ECOA, there's like, you know, mobile phones where we collect EKGs from, etc. What about you? Like, what do you feel that has been an innovation that came into this industry that has really changed? That's been, I don't know, for a lack of better words, is something that really changed where the industry is going.
Yeah, I think what I'm sensing and noticing more now is that there is a little bit more pragmatism around the data that's being collected. And I'm referring now to real world evidence and some of the regulations that seem to be more risk based and looking more intently around quality, not quantity, and making decisions from less data points. And I think that can only be a good thing. You're talking about Delve and what Delve does. I know that your specialism is around concierge and making patient trials more accessible for the patients and to retain them for as long as possible. And I think the reduction of data points has got to be one of those things, as much as being cognizant of the challenges that come of being a patient in a clinical trial. You can't always turn up on time. You certainly can't always stick to the schedule of assessments just because it's written in a protocol. Sometimes life happens, your child might be ill, or you might be ill, or there might be a failure in a blood draw or something like that, a computer, a technical issue, something goes down. So the reality is just that pragmatism that I think regulators are really leaning into now, in the fact that they seem a lot more willing to accept storytelling around how data might be collected and what's best for the patient, putting the patient at the center of all of the data collection. That's the thing that floats my boat, of course. And that's the issue I think I've noticed most recently that seems to be coming into focus a little bit more.
Do you feel that innovation needs to be a technology always, or what do you think of innovation?
Well, tech companies would always say tech first, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
I think in reality, we're humans. We're people, and we have a pulse, and we have emotions, and we have compassion. And so, therefore, with technology, it kind of brings in the robot approach, doesn't it? That we all just comply and we fit in a box. And I think to your earlier example of OCR, we don't all fit in the box. Data doesn't always fit in the box. Sometimes there's a squiggly comment field that actually has more empirical data in that squiggly comments field than actually the whole CRF page itself. But you miss that because that's not the thing that is being put into that primary safety or secondary efficacy variable.
And where do you feel, it's actually it's interesting because as we talk about innovation, right? In my prior example where we said like it doesn't always work, but where, as you worked, kind of in your consulting world across all the different clients, where do you feel like things have really kind of broken down where you see like this is where we got to fix? Is it CRO? Is it site? Is it patient? Is it data?
It's a Venn diagram. It's the overlapping points, isn't it? To me, it's all of those. It's all of those overlapping points. It's the points where they touch one another, I would say, because it's never one thing, just one thing. It's compliance, it's alignment around patient, site, CRO, sponsor. But every one of them has a different set of priorities. And I think in a very bureaucratic organization around a clinical trial, well, who shouts loudest? Usually it's the sponsor that's paying the bills. So decisions are made and filtered down based upon who shouts loudest and who has the most autonomy for those decisions.
I
But
feel like,
really, again, go on.
yeah, I feel like whoever shouts the loudest, I feel like that's kind of changing a little bit, don't you?
Well, tell me about it. Tell me from your experience. I'd love to hear that.
I feel like sites now are shouting the loudest. Because
And
they're the
why?
one. because they're the ones that are running the study, right? They're the ones that like have the patients. They're the ones that are bringing in the patients. And honestly, if you don't have sites, you don't have patients, right? And so sites now, they have a control. They always have, but I feel like their voice is getting stronger and stronger, and sponsors are starting to hone in more on it, which is interesting. I mean, from our perspective, we look at it and we're like, to your point, like who shall allow to sponsor CRO sites? But then we, from our perspective, excuse me, we look at compliance and we're like, well, who owns compliance then? Is it the sponsor? Is it the site? Is it the CRO? You know?
There isn't really an independence around quality. I suppose you would say that the regulators can come in at any time. You've got to be audit ready always now. I think that's something certainly that we've seen change over the years. Whereas in the past, you might get a little bit of notice when a regulator was coming in or a sponsor might be coming in. Now you've got to be audit ready and squeaky clean all the time, haven't you?
Mhm.
That's definitely something that's changed. And I think that quality component comes from each one of those main stakeholders. They've all got to be on top of quality issues.
Yeah, I mean it's quality, but then also when we look at like patient compliance, right? Because it all kind of works together, right? If you have the right data from the patients, you have quality data to present to the FDA. But how do you make sure that the patient is truly compliant throughout your entire study? And who owns that continuity of that data? You know, as we run clinical trials, or not us, but sponsors or CROs, they will hire the sites, and everybody will keep looking at the sites. You're like, hey, listen, this is your problem. But then we sit here and we look at it, we're like, is it really their problem? They're overburdened, they don't have enough staff. But it's a big question. It's up till today with all the tech we have, with all the AI we have, compliance still remains one of the biggest issues in the industry. And it's interesting because even as we look at different tech and different vendors, we see that everybody counts compliance in a different manner. But it's still the number one question is like, well, who owns that continuity within the study? Who owns compliance? I don't know. Like, what have you seen? Like, what that, I don't know, is something that you guys look into?
It's an interesting point because compliance, as I say, comes from every different angle of that clinical trial Venn diagram, doesn't it? Everyone is responsible for their own level of compliance.
Mhm.
I'm talking now from the patients and safety activities and data collection and site ownership. All of those particular stakeholders have a part to play in compliance. I don't think one has more importance than any other. But if there were one particular point, it would be getting one's arms around the organizations together to ensure compliance is continued through all aspects of that. And I don't know whether there is a perfect world for that. It's
Yeah.
not something I've been that close to, if I'm honest, most recently, because many of the recent activities I've been working with have been around tech implementation, to be honest.
Mhm.
So I've been a little bit removed from the day-to-day patient activities that I had earlier on in my career when I was heading up early phase clinical trial units, for example. Their compliance was absolutely front and center every single day. And it would be a case of my desk being sat by the door, seeing patients coming in through the door, checking them in by the patient recruitment guys, entering their data and reviewing them, taking their bloods and getting them on the studies and into beds. So it's been a very different world for me these last few years, I would say.
You ever wonder what would it be like if you were to run or design your own study?
I regularly have conversations with people, not just on the podcast that I host, but generally around that point. Because, like you and like me, there are lots of interested entrepreneur types who like to push the boundaries. And so these are shoot the breeze type conversations that I don't always hit record on. But yeah, it's happening quite a lot because when you get to a level of experience and understanding of how these things work, particularly when you've seen the value of some of these contracts. I'm talking about monetary value. You just want a little piece of that pie. You don't need a big bit, just a tiny little
A
bit,
little
just
bit.
enough. But that awareness that being open to costings and bid defenses, you can see what other people are charging for their activities, and you think, "Wow, really? Have they really earned that?" Because I'd questioned that many times.
Given that you've done a lot with data recently, and as you look at clinical studies, whether it's real world evidence or what's or not, what operational metrics do you feel have mattered the most? And where do you feel areas from an operational metric perspective that you feel like we haven't really looked at it as close and we really need to give it a bit of an eye?
So operational metrics makes me think about real world platforms and dashboards in which you can see what's happening on a minute by minute basis. And in answer to your question, the metrics that matter the most has got to be patient retention. That's the first thing. Because without patients, you haven't got anything. You've got no clinical trial, you've got nothing. You've certainly got no data points that are of value. And around that, I think also we should never forget about patient safety. I do bang on about it because it's something that's been instilled in me for my entire career, which is putting patients at the heart of everything that we do, always considering the patient. Are they well? Are they okay? What's happening for them outside of their clinical trial? These are the questions that often don't get asked, certainly within case report forms or within protocols, but actually they're the conversations that should be happening in the corridors of those clinical trial units of those sites to make sure that those patients are actually okay and well enough to continue doing what they're doing, to share their information, and hopefully get something worthwhile out of being involved in a clinical trial. So I never step too far away from that particular metric more than any other.
Patient safety is interesting, man. I feel like one of the biggest things that everybody's they're afraid of, they don't want to see more adverse events on their case report forms or their diaries, etc. And it's a question we always ask. You want to ask, add safety questions, right? Like I think I even heard in one of the stories, one of the colleagues at a different company was like, why are we not asking quality of life questionnaires for every single clinical trial? You know? So patient safety to me is one that honestly probably one that always boggles my mind,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Um, but a lot of times we don't want to ask those questions because guess what? If you've got more adverse events that are happening, it might tip the scale on your clinical trial. Your regulators might look at it and it might actually hurt your study more than anything else. But if you were to talk to a sponsor and you say, hey, here's really where we should really focus from a clinical trial perspective over the next 2 or 3 years, or here's where you should be focusing on for your next set of clinical trials, what would those be?
There's some very simple things that I think drive retention. They need to make they need to make clinical trials more accommodating and more flexible. And I think we've seen patient recorded outcome devices and eCOA devices, but actually some of the things that I think would probably make patients' lives a lot easier already exist today now. There's plenty of smart tech. I think I saw you wearing a very clever ring on your finger, if I'm correct. But we don't need to even be wearing Apple Watches anymore. I'm obviously wearing an analog watch because I hate my wrist to be pinging. I couldn't imagine it. But the tech already exists. This is what I'm saying. If you make it autonomous and simple and more simpler for the patient, then those quality of life measures become complementary to the data that's already being collected. And I think this is something that probably pre-COVID pandemic was starting to happen more. Then we had a little bit of remote monitoring and decentralized trials. I haven't seen too much evidence of building those tech, the smart tech into some of the newer opportunities that are coming our way. I haven't
Yeah, yeah.
seen that. I don't know whether you have.
It's coming a little bit. I think the industry, what was interesting, yeah, I mean, now you're talking into digital biomarkers, which we haven't seen a clinical trial been approved because of a digital biomarker yet. I think that's kind of where the struggle is. However, we're seeing more of a need from a wearable perspective. You know, when we came into this industry, kind of our number one selling solution is kind of our wearable platform. You actually, if I was to turn the screen down a little bit, you'd be like, you need to clean your desk, dude. Because I got like a set. I've got like two Apple, got like an Actigraph device. My wife, when kids walk in, they're like, what is this? Radio Shack? I mean, or Best Buy, I guess. Like I'm like dating myself now when I said Radio Shack. I mean, the tech is here. It's the data that we get out of it. I think it's, is it compliant enough? Is it kind of what regulators want to see? There's also some issues with some of these devices, right? From like wear time and wear compliance and things of that nature. So innovation is here, things come in slow. However, from a digital biomarker, depends where the scale is going to go. Real world evidence has been an interesting area for us quite a bit in post market studies because there's so much you can do with these patients at home, with the devices at home, and you can collect a lot more accurate data. You don't have to keep asking the patients to come into the office. So, you know, personally, I feel like that this is kind of where the industry is really going and where there's going to be a lot more of it. But is it a trend? Is it going to stick? Is it going to grow? I don't know. I look at AI, it's just kind of honestly just I look at it as a it's a trend. Is it here to stick or is it a hype? There's probably a bit of an overhype as we've seen it. What, only 5% of AIs are working and 95% are flop, you know? But yeah, I mean, what's one trend that you feel has been overrated in this industry?
Well, the thing, as you described, the thing that is being talked about everywhere is AI. Now, that can mean different things to different people, but to me, right now in clinical trials, I've seen some really impressive demos of, let's say, data collection tools that do automatic medical coding that can code 95% of medical dictionary terms first pass. Similarly, they can clean data, raise queries, and even with a human in the loop, I think reduce cycle time very, very quickly. But I think more broadly, I did recently see a phenomenal tool that was an AI inspired tool that pushed a protocol into electronic data capture tools pre-built. That could be a game changer because if you think about the time it takes to from a protocol to build an electronic data capture tool to first subject in, what's the shortest cycle time you've ever seen it done in? Probably 6 to 8 weeks in early phase, I would say.
Yep.
If something could do that and push it through immediately, and then you've got human in the loop reviewing that, potentially you could bring that down to maybe a couple of weeks or less.
Yes,
I think that's quite feasible.
the UAT has probably been one of the areas that takes some time, right? So it's the
Yeah.
testing. How do you make sure like, your AI or your solution is truly doing the right testing at that level and things of that nature. But yeah, I've seen a couple of tools that have done that quite well. I'm excited about those solutions. I'm excited because I feel like it's gonna really help push our industry forward. But yeah, it's been interesting. Adam, thank you so much for being here with me. Thank you for the conversation. I've learned quite a bit from you. I always have. And honestly, I've always admired the conversations with you. If you were
Thank
to
you.
punt one question to my next person that I speak to on the podcast, what would that question be? Something that you would want them to answer, not knowing who that person is.
What is the principle that stays with you that you think about when you wake up every day?
I love it. I'm going to ask that and I'll let you know, or you'll hear it on the next podcast.
I'm looking forward to that. Can I also compliment you, Wissam? You were one of the first people I ever had on the first podcast I got involved in, where I co-hosted, and you've always been extremely generous with your time. I'm really delighted that you've decided to go into the world of podcasting and opening up conversations yourself, because you're extremely calm, considered, and I think you've got a lovely personality. And though I've never met you in person, I know that we would have a great conversation over a zero alcohol beer.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much, Adam. Me.